Picture this. You are tasked with building an entire nation's education system. But here's the catch. You are starting from literal scratch. No infrastructure, a dizzying legal framework, and ideologicals that are constantly shifting. Well, in today's Explainer, we're going on a 60-year journey to see exactly how Pakistan pulled that off. It is a massive story of a nation experimenting, struggling, and finally realizing that educating its youth wasn't just some nice policy goal. It was an absolute human right. So let's just dive right in.
To make sense of all this complex history, we'll follow a quick roadmap. Starting from scratch, the Great Commissions, the policy pendulum, the constitutional framework, and lastly, education as a right.
All right, Section 1, starting from scratch. Back in 1947, a newly independent Pakistan faced incredibly low literacy and basically zero educational infrastructure. So, they held the very first educational conference in Karachi, under Quaid-e-Azam, focusing on three main things right out of the gate: instilling an Islamic spirit, driving scientific progress, and building strong moral values.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Great Commissions. The government quickly knew they needed more than just a grand vision. They needed actual expert blueprints to figure out how to build a functioning nationwide school system.
And you can really see that diagnostic era in two wildly different approaches. First, you've got Ayub Khan's 1959 Sharif Commission. This was a highly centralized push rooted in Islamic values, recommending free education up to the 10th grade and creating the University Grants Commission. But then, fast forward just a decade to 1969, and Air Marshal Noor Khan comes in with a totally different vibe. His commission argued that strict centralization was deeply flawed, so they pushed for practical provincial control, totally slashed rote learning, and pivoted hard towards science, math, and job-oriented skills.
So the obvious question here is, did any of these incredibly detailed blueprints actually become reality? The short, somewhat frustrating answer, no. Both of these brilliant commissions were basically kneecapped by severe implementation issues. The Sharif Commission, starved of funds and bogged down by constant political turnover. And Noor Khan's decentralized vision, it was completely derailed by the devastating 1971 war and the separation of East Pakistan. The ideas were definitely there, but the foundation just kept shaking.
Moving right along into Section 3, the policy pendulum.
Because those early foundations really struggled to stick, the national educational strategy started swinging wildly depending on exactly who held the reins of power. I mean, imagine the absolute whiplash for schools during this time. In '59, we have that centralized Sharif policy. By 1972 under Bhutto, a massive aggressive push to nationalize schools and colleges. Then just a few years later in 1979 under Zia-ul-Haq, the pendulum violently swings toward the Islamization of the curriculum, heavily emphasizing madrasas. And then, by 1992 under Nawaz Sharif, we swing all the way back to aggressive privatization and expanding technology. It was quite literally a constant, dramatic reinvention of the wheel.
Eventually, policymakers realized they desperately needed to stop the swinging and stabilize the whole system. The 2009 National Education Policy, under the PPP era, tried to do exactly that. Instead of pushing pure ideology, they finally anchored the system to modern, measurable targets. We're talking 100% literacy and enrollment, actual gender equality, and making secondary education completely free.
Let's look at Section 4, the constitutional framework. While the politicians were playing this huge tug-of-war with policies, the Constitution was desperately trying to tie it all down into a stable legal framework.
And you can see that bureaucratic whiplash play out legally, too. In 1956, education was mostly treated as a provincial subject with an Islamic focus. But then in 1962, under a presidential system, they flipped the script completely to strong federal control over universities to push technological progress. It actually wasn't until the 1973 Constitution, which, by the way, is still in force today, that the nation finally settled on a democratic federal structure.
Which brings us to the climax of our journey. Section 5, Education as a Right.
See, under that 1973 Constitution, Articles 37B and 38D did establish goals for free education and equal opportunity. But there was a massive catch here. These were just directive principles. Think of them as really strong suggestions, or maybe national goals. They absolutely were not legally enforceable mandates that a citizen could walk into a court of law and demand.
So why does all this constitutional history matter to you today?
Because in 2010, the game completely changed. The 18th Amendment birthed Article 25A, which boldly declared that free and compulsory education is a fundamental right for all children aged 5 to 16.
For the very first time in the nation's history, a child's education was no longer just a talking point. It was a legally enforceable human right.
And there's a really amazing historical payoff here, too. That same 18th Amendment handed full control of education back to the provinces. It took over 40 years, but the decentralized, province-led vision that Air Marshal Noor Khan was passionately fighting for way back in 1969, it was finally realized.
So, zooming out to look at the big picture, over 6 decades, the nation's system essentially matured through 4 massive steps. It went from a desperate search for foundational ideology in the 50s into intense Islamization in the 70s, then pivoting toward modernization in the 90s, until finally cementing education as an undeniable fundamental right in 2010. Which leaves us with one incredibly vital question to ponder. The fight to make education a legal mandate on paper was long and honestly pretty brutal. But now that the right actually exists, how is the next generation going to ensure it is enforced in reality? That is the massive challenge moving forward. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you in the next one.